Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by the founder and administrator of the Luxembourg Footy X account, Bence. How you doing, mate? It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation as well. I'm really glad to be here and to be guiding you through all these topics basically that you've just touched upon. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. A lot of clubs with great history and a lot of clubs with links to Racing Club Luxembourg that I feel should be mentioned in the next minutes, hours, whatever it's going to be.
Exactly, and if we'd love for this conversation to go on for hours, and maybe one day we will, because there's so many interesting facets and nuances to football in Luxembourg. But as Bence has mentioned there, we're going to be talking about one specific club called Racing Club Luxembourg, as they were once known. Now under a different name, we're going to be talking about the merger culture of Luxembourg and a little bit about football in Luxembourg as it is now. There's a lot of really interesting things in football in Luxembourg, a nation which doesn't really get a lot of attention as a big footballing nation, but hopefully our listeners after this episode will have changed their minds on that. But just before we get stuck into things, Bence, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Oh, thanks for the question. Well, as you could hear, I'm Bence. I'm running the Football in Luxembourg Twitter page and everything associated with it. It's really not been a big project so far. I started it when lockdown came around. Of course, I needed some pastime to do. I've always loved football, loved reporting, giving something new to a new audience, gaining followers and talking about the stuff in football that doesn't really get mentioned because I hate the big players, the big leagues being overhyped all the time, the Premier League being spoken about as the absolute pinnacle of football as if there was nothing beneath it and no more interesting stories that are lying under in the semi-professional or amateur leagues. And so that's why I started to follow Luxembourg football more carefully, sort of like, following the results, the teams, because it looked like something was on the rise, something was happening under the surface. So I wanted to dive a little bit deeper. And that's why I started it like 3 years ago. And hopefully it will continue to grow and I will continue to stay active on it because it's really been an amazing journey so far for me. I have gotten podcast requests, of course, and a freelance job really, just typing about whatever I want to talk about and type about. And of course, that's mostly Luxembourg Football League because it truly is one of the most unpredictable and exciting and obscure hobbies that one can have, I think. So, well, I think that describes me pretty much up to now. Of course, I'm looking forward to more collaborations or chances to speak or write for anyone. If you ever wondered anything about Luxembourgish football or just have a question or want to have a friendly discussion, feel free to hit me up. You can find me on Twitter at Luxembourg Footy, as has already been mentioned as well. So thank you for the chance to introduce myself.
Oh, not at all, mate. As I said, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. The more niche the story, the better. And if we can highlight some of the amazing stories from football and nations which don't normally get the attention they deserve, then even better. As I mentioned earlier on, the club we're going to be covering today started life as Racing Club Luxembourg. They've been through a number of name changes and either absorbed or merged with a few other clubs too. So the club can actually argue that their lineage traces back to the original Racing Club Luxembourg, which is quite unique considering a lot of the clubs that we discuss on this show. They were founded in 1907 as one of the first clubs in Luxembourg, and they competed in the national division. I say in air quotes because it was actually competed as a knockout tournament due to there not actually being enough clubs to take part at that period in time.
The first ever football club in Luxembourg was founded in 1906, so it wasn't until decades later that there was a proper amount of teams to actually hold the league structure and stuff. But we'll get to that later.
Yeah, no, we certainly will. But they got off to a flying start in their early history, at least. They won the entire championship, if you want to call it that. But then they didn't actually enter the league the following year, which I found quite interesting. Was there any specific reason for that, Bence, or was it just one of those nuances of football beginning to develop in a country which was just adopting the game?
I did not find the reason actually because I think it was all just a bit on again, off again with Luxembourgish football at the time. Like the clubs didn't have a set 11 players yet, and it was all really just at the beginning, the forming of everything. So it was completely normal for a team to just say, okay, we'll just come again next year. We're not bothered this year for one reason or another.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. And it can be down to a number of factors as well at the end of the day, can't it? They did come back into the league though in 1911-12, and they had a number of players represented on the international stage in Luxembourg's first ever match in France, which is pretty decent considering. They finished third out of the four clubs in the division, again in air quotes, and then the league stopped for another year. Presumably, as you mentioned, it could have been a stopgap just to get organised, or could have been a million and one other reasons for that. And then Luxembourg actually recorded their first ever friendly win over France, which is incredible. And I'm assuming that Luxembourg played against France and other surrounding nations quite a bit at this time as well. Then,
Yeah, just like when England played Scotland in all of the first ever international games, because of course they were just close enough geographically, and so that's why Luxembourg ended up playing Netherlands, France, and Germany, or sometimes Belgium whenever they played. Also, for the previous point where you said that all the new football associations couldn't really hold competition with several teams at the beginning, and so that's why they have such a small number of teams in those early years. It's also important to note that the comparison to Mexico is very flattering indeed, because Luxembourg has a population of 650,000, if I remember well. So that's like the size of Sheffield, if I remember correctly. So that's the size of the country that you're working with. So just to have four teams up and running, get a league done every year, that's already quite some feat. Back in the 1910s, when several countries didn't even have it all set up yet, I think.
yeah, absolutely. It's a massive thing, and it must have been a massive achievement for them as well. I quite like the comparison you made there between how it was like Scotland and England, or so it's whenever Luxembourg and France play each other in international competitions today. Is it seen as like a big rivalry? Is that something that's always kind of persisted?
Of course, unfortunately, it's a rivalry. Of course, I'm saying unfortunately because whoever Luxembourg face, they are still not considered the favourites.
Sure.
But actually, a couple of years ago, they got a nil-nil draw in a qualifying section. So that was like a huge upset. And that's like getting one over them finally after all
Yeah.
those losses. Because, of course, it's a delicate situation from one point of view. Because when you lose to France, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Like,
Yep.
we're a small country. We're literally smaller than like 10 of your cities. But on the other hand, if you only lose by one, or if you get a scummy draw or like a 1-0 win, then it's already something to brag about and something to tell the French about and let them know just who the better one is in the region.
No, yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. It's a wee bit of bragging rights as well, isn't it? So yeah, for sure. I mean, in any of these games, you take whatever result you can get, and if you're the underdog and pull off even a draw in one of those games, it can be really massive and a sign that things are improving for the nation. But yeah, I mean, you take what you can get in some of these games.
Honestly, yeah, like there's an attitude of that there's nothing to lose. There's no expectations before a game. But that has changed in the past couple of years, actually. Of course, that doesn't mean we don't celebrate the win, but it's like it's kind of realistic. Like you just start to look forward to the games more because you're not just going to witness the 11 best players in Luxembourg, but you're actually going to see some quality play on show. And instead, they might get some of the big guys, and they actually beat Turkey and Bosnia and Herzegovina this year and last year, respectively. So there is progress, and
Sure.
now they've got every chance to make it to the Euro 2024 because, as I've said, they've beaten Bosnia, they've beaten the last spot team, whoever it was in the group. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on that one.
That's
But
okay.
they also drew with Slovakia, and they have Portugal and Iceland to play. Actually, they lost to Portugal by a massive amount, but that doesn't really matter because, of course, Portugal will qualify in first place. It's
Yeah.
really just Iceland to beat, and then a point or two against Slovakia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they are really in contention. So it's really encouraging so far.
Yeah, well, we hope to see you there. And correct me if I'm wrong, but would it be right in saying that throughout the kind of footballing history of Luxembourg, particularly when it came to the national team, there's always been this kind of issue with dual citizenship where a number of players would rather declare for other nations. Am I thinking of someone else, or is that about right?
Sorry, what do you mean?
So when I suppose it differs depending on the FA, but basically, if there's a player that comes up through the ranks in Luxembourg and they're incredible, when it comes to them moving to a club outside of Luxembourg, they'll maybe go elsewhere, but then they'll get to maybe a top five league. and then they will maybe have something, an issue with dual citizenship. So they'll maybe be Luxembourgish and also French, for instance, and then they can declare
Yeah.
for France. Has that been an issue, or is that something that I've just made up, or am I thinking of another national team?
It still is an issue, and it does happen every once in a while. Unfortunately, it happened with one of the biggest stars that could have been for Luxembourg, which is Miralem Pjanic, the well-known Bosnian midfielder who spent his entire childhood in Luxembourg. Of course, he's a child of Bosnian parents, so it's kind of understandable why he went for them after having performed good enough to be called up for them as well. But it was frustrating to see him play at under 17, under 19 level for Luxembourg, and then suddenly just switch when the senior part came around and then scored free kicks against Luxembourg at other games. So of course it was a little bit of personal revenge to get one over him when we played Bosnia and won in June. It was nice to show him that there is a change of guards and we might actually be Bosnia's level at this point. And so he could have reconsidered his future back then.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it's been an issue for a few other nations as well. I mean, obviously with a number of African nations in France as well. Sometimes, we'll often get English players who have Scottish grandparents. They'll come, which is fine. I have absolutely no issue with it whatsoever. But yeah, I can imagine it would be a bit of an issue for Luxembourg. And as you said there, Pjanic probably being the most notable one. So yeah, I know I didn't make it up. I know I got it somewhere.
Yeah, it comes up sometimes, of course, when I'm tweeting about Bosnia or Chiflange, because that's Pjanic's hometown club, and they've just made it up to the top division for the first time in 23 years. So it's an absolutely huge celebration for them, and then a great period of a possible golden era. Pjanic still have ties to that club, and actually sent them a video message on Instagram before the season came around. So it was nice to see that he still uh, remembers his roots and is still grateful for his Luxembourgish upbringings, even though he ended up choosing Bosnia in the end.
Yeah, I mean, it does happen, unfortunately, and it's a massive shame when it does. But obviously, Racing Club Luxembourg were flying at this point in time as well. But then World War One comes along and affects them pretty heavily, doesn't it?
World War One, yeah, they were affected to some extent, but it wasn't as pronounced because, of course, as I've said, the league really didn't take a shape in terms of having a solid amount of teams to compete every year. So when a team withdrew from one season, it wasn't known whether it's just the usual whatever reason they had, or whether it was because of the World War One. Luxembourgish weren't strictly involved in that one. But World War II did have a really serious effect on teams. Teams had to get renamed. The competitions did get on, so it didn't stop in the end. But Germany invaded Luxembourg in 1940, so the 4 years from then on were quite chaotic, as Luxembourgers were also called up to the army, the German army. So they didn't really have much of a choice, and of course that affected the league a bit more heavily and resulted in unexpected teams winning the championships because there really was a lot to do for the clubs to manage that situation, of course, as you would expect.
Yeah, we've touched on it in other episodes too, and I think there's probably a few podcasts in there on how war actually affects football clubs and different football associations in different ways too, both socially and otherwise. But after World War One, their complex lineage sort of begins here, I suppose, Bence, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm fine to continue. So basically, I think there's one thing that has to be noted about Racing Club that hasn't already, is that they were the ones who won the first Luxembourgish Championship and the first Luxembourgish Cup season in 1921-22. So that's I think kind of unique double in Europe. I never actually looked it up, but there were 13 years between the two competitions, and Steel Racing ended up winning both, despite not being the only powerhouse in the nation. They had one major rivals, Sporting Club Luxembourg, who, as luck would have it, they ended up merging with the two big rivals in the capital city. And until that point, it really was I don't know. I think a kind of a roller coaster for racing. They did great sometimes and had other titles before the cup win and after their first league title, but weren't always near the top. So of course some of the clubs were founded in the 1910s because it was a time when most of the traditional Luxembourgish clubs came about and started setting up and competing. So that meant a bit of a decline in racing club sportions as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're spot on. Because in 1921 they won their first league title by steamrolling the second division, and then 13 years later they won their first cup. But that decline in fortunes, I suppose, kind of came about because the second tier was founded, but for a couple other reasons as well.
Yeah, it was really interesting because by the time they won the cup, they had already been relegated once. So that means by 1922 there was a second division in Luxembourg already in place, and they won that by a perfect record, 14 out of 14 games won, and in the same season managed to win the first Coupe de Luxembourg competition. Of course, that's the main cup, like the equivalent to the FA Cup. So that's how they achieved this strange double, winning the second division and the cup in the same year.
And this was also around the time that they merged for the first time, though, I think, as well. And interestingly as well, because they merged with who at the time were their big rivals. So tell us a little bit more about that, because there's quite a lot that we can pull out just from this event, if you like, alone.
Yeah, so it was a result of heated discussions, as local reports said from back in the 1920s, when I think the reason, like, it wasn't quite specified, and it's still not exactly known even now, but usually these mergers back then took place because one team had a much better pitch than the other one, and there just weren't many pitches in Luxembourg back then, so as to avoid the difficulty of scheduling games and that, they decided to just come up with a solution that could fit the supporters in the better pitch and make them watch a better quality play than I don't know, having to attend two different stadiums. So that's why Racing merged with Sporting as well. And so their name, the new club's name, was Spora Luxembourg. Of course, the first three letters taken from Sporting and the first two from Racing. Uh,
I like that. Just like a combination of the names. It's class. Like it a lot.
Exactly. They combined the colours as well because Racing had been a blue team and Sporting were yellow. So they played in blue and yellow. And it didn't go well with fans at all, as you would imagine, of course. It's like merging Manchester United and Manchester City on a much bigger level, of course, and bigger scale. But it's the same sort of thing. They were main rivals. They won most of the titles in Luxembourg up until that point. And then the boards of the two clubs suddenly just announced that they were going to merge together. So it took some time for the fans to sink in, but I think the club were way better off with it, and then we're going to see it later when we look at sports history in more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing, though, that this was fairly common at the time then. I mean, it's rare that there's going to be anything close to fan-owned clubs as we know them today during that period of time. The landscape of football was completely different, for lack of a better term. So there's nothing really stopping rival clubs from merging with each other, is there? I mean, I can imagine that some fans may have still been unhappy about it, but, there's nothing really stopping them. And I suppose there's maybe even the argument to be made that there wasn't the same depth and strength of identity and heritage, which would see so many people outraged two big rivals merging now.
They were all fan-owned clubs, and there never really discussions of changing that structure up or anyone buying a club at that point. I think it just wasn't viewed as having the potential to actually generate resources for anyone to be worth it, because Luxembourgish football still isn't professional up to this point. So I think it'd be, I don't know, just not a wise decision economically. It'd be a bit of a money burner, really, if you invest in Luxembourgish football right now. So they were all fan-owned clubs, and so they didn't really have a choice when they ran out of money. They either had to watch their teams go bankrupt and just cease to exist, or turn to sometimes their biggest enemies, or whoever was the closest to them geographically, because that's the most sensible move, of course, to merge two teams. And so, however disappointed fans could have been, it was still the best choice for those teams. If we look into the situation, it probably wasn't easy for them financially to manage the period after the First World War.
Yeah, it's really like a sink or swim type scenario, and I suppose this is again is something we've spoken about before when clubs merge and the impact that it can have on fans in terms of identity and the fans of those clubs don't have that kind of shared heritage that comes with supporting a select football team. So there's all that to consider as well. And I don't want to make it seem like that I'm ignoring that or anything, but I suppose what would the fans have rathered? Would they have rathered to support no football club, or would they rather have supported a football club at the very least that was stronger, financially stable and viable, and had a chance of competing at a better level. So I suppose that's what has to be asked. But again, I don't want to go and overshadow the other issues because they are very important as well. So it's one of those ones. Like I said, it's either a sink or swim. But no, it is actually quite interesting to hear that they were all actually fan owned, as you kind of mentioned. And maybe are still now. Again, that's probably a podcast for another time, but that's actually really fascinating. So, as per, we're always finding out that these things need to be taken on a kind of case by case or nation by nation basis. But, it worked for them at the time, the merger. They were really successful in their first few years under this new banner, if you want to call it that. They beat some pretty big names. Just like the club that would become Fola-ish, also Dudelange, who at the time still existed in their original form.
No, unfortunately, they also merged with someone else, and that someone else merged with that someone else, and that resulted in the current Dudelange team that played in the Euro a few years ago. So yeah, it was a long, complicated story, just like this will be, to be fair.
Yeah, no doubt. And I guess the same can probably be said for Differdange too, who the new Racing Club Luxembourg also faced. But entering the 30s, how were things going for the club at this point? I think it's safe to say they were certainly on the rise, I think would be fair.
It was a great period, sort of golden era for them because they were the only ones who were able to deliver that sort of consistency year in, year out. Because you've just mentioned three different teams that won the championship above them. Of course, that's nice. But Spora were the ones who were always in the top two, so always contesting for the biggest prizes. So that's how they became the number one powerhouse in Luxembourg, basically. I think. That's what I found on it. I think when I researched the article.
Yeah, I mean, they dominated the league and they became regular cup finalists during this period as well. So this was, as you said, pretty much their golden era. So moving then into the post-war era, what was the landscape of football in Luxembourg like at that point in time? Did it take a while for clubs in the league to rebuild as it did in other European nations?
Yeah, well, in the 50s it was a little bit bleak, but it actually didn't take that long until Luxembourg stopped lagging behind other nations because in the 60s they were already able to produce European level stars. I think star might actually be a bit of a stretch because we've never heard about these people ever since. But there's this striker, for example, Liam Nuremberg, who scored a hat trick for Nice against Real Madrid in the first European Cup. I think it was the final, might not have been, but still a hat trick against Real in the European Cup is quite massive. And he was a player who later came back to Spora as a player manager and won the league in two consecutive seasons. That was actually the major bounce back from Spora after World War II because it took more than a decade for them to find their feet again after kind of losing their spirits in World War II, which nobody can really be blamed about.
Nah, definitely. Yeah, no, sure. That's yeah, it's just one of those things that's totally understandable. I mean, they did have a pretty crazy game against Dortmund at one point, though, a 5-all aggregate draw. But then sadly got thumped 7-0 by them in the third game replay. But I mean, even still, that's surely one of the better, if not the best, results that a Luxembourg club has ever put up in Europe.
Yeah, that's still outstanding, definitely. Like even when a team from Luxembourg hosts a club of Dortmund stature, that's already considered a milestone, like a huge showpiece occasion that they once played a big team. It's not even about the results usually. It's just that they memorably played Real Madrid once or Milan once, and it's it's always in I don't know, in brackets or just I don't know, kind of forgotten about or not really talked about that they ended up losing that game by 7 or 8 goals because that's a different story altogether. It's just the feat that they host these major teams and play 90 minutes against superstars, which really matters. So, of course, to achieve a draw against Borussia Dortmund, absolutely unbelievable and still hasn't been forgotten over the country. One of the biggest European results I've brought up.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, no wonder. Looks like a cracking game, especially over the first two legs before the replay. And even then, that's 17 goals across 3 games, so absolutely incredible. Glamour Tie probably doesn't even cut it, to be honest. But Racing Club Luxembourg then went through a bit of a barren spell, though, and fell behind the rest of the pack, really. Only winning 2 titles in, I think, if my maths is right, was around 40 years. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, that you mentioned that 4 decades, it's a huge time frame, so it's really hard to talk about as one big component that affected them. So let's break it down into pieces because I think one of the major takeaways from it is that in the first period of that era, from 1959 to 1972, the capital of Luxembourg was still able to celebrate 15 titles, leagues and cups in those 13 years. So it was a majorly successful year for the city, just not for the team, who were always second best usually and beaten by their rivals, who were of course results from other mergers in the city. So that wasn't really their most successful period, partly because they ended up selling their best players every year, every other year, because that was the year that I mentioned, the 60s, when the best Luxembourgish footballs ever came around, possibly. And I'm talking about players that played a decade or so in French Ligue 1. Like, I don't know, best teams were Strasbourg, Nice, I think in that era, and Luxembourgish footballers were usually the best French teams, at least one or two of them. So, of course, Spora, who had a decent-ish academy, but also tended to not be able to lure the players, that were so talented to long-term contracts, but instead had to let them go to bigger French clubs to achieve their dreams. They found themselves lagging behind other teams who perhaps had a bit less talented players, but those players were at least not in the spotlight, so they could manage to keep them for longer. And actually, that means one of the biggest drawbacks for Spora was that they had such a great squad that foreign clubs paid attention to it and regularly poached the biggest talents. So that was part of the reason why they weren't successful enough. And as for the other reasons, there were other teams that could be mentioned. Aris Bonvois was one of the teams that challenged Spora regularly in the 60s and then basically dipped forever. So that was really, I don't know, kind of surprising and interesting to read about their history. They were kind of new then, and they just kept winning league titles and cup titles until something stopped, and they never again won any piece of silverware until they also merged with someone in 2001. And they also merged into Spora in 2005. And so that club is still around. They're called Racing Union Luxembourg right now. But we'll get to that later, really. Broad history lesson for all the clubs and all these branches and family trees of clubs in Luxembourg that have resulted over the decades.
Oh yeah, I mean, I really, really like how you've spoken about that there. I really like the language and the terminology that you've used, and as a concept, actually referring to them as branches and family trees is really interesting because it's like lineage is stretching back, In other nations like Belgium and Iceland have merger cultures as well, but for entirely different reasons to Luxembourg. And in the case of Belgium, certainly it's often quite negative and there's a lot of negative connotations. So to describe it as like branches and family trees stretching back to the entire history of football in the nation is actually a big positive thing, and maybe something that the nation should look to take advantage of in the future and really just, kind of platforming and promoting, and ultimately what helps preserve their football heritage as well. And at the end of the day, that's what this project is all about, trying to spread a bit more knowledge and awareness about that. But it's just, in some ways though, it's also viewed as like a kind of necessity to keep clubs afloat, which can also be negative as well. But in terms of Racing Club Luxembourg, they didn't have any luck in Europe during the 60s either, being in the end of some rather heavy defeats. But I'm guessing, though, that football in Luxembourg was still at least semi-professional at this time, though, yeah. And during the 60s, you've got some real European powerhouse clubs coming through who would have been miles beyond the clubs from Luxembourg at that point.
It was still amateur, and I believe it was amateur until up until the 80s or 90s when a bit more money was finally invested into the clubs. It was still not a major amount played. Of course, still have to play part-time jobs even now, but that was when they made the switch. So back when Spora wasn't so successful as you mentioned in the 70s and 80s, it was partly because they couldn't give full-time contracts to their best players, unlike clubs in the neighboring countries. They're all professional up until the lower divisions.
Right, okay, got you. So, yeah, right, I'm with you now. It was then that they entered the Cup Winners' Cup and had a few other spells in Europe, but again they had little to no success, sadly. And then we entered the 2000s, where they became the club that they are today, more or less.
Perhaps I could introduce the only real competitor of Spora at the time to these eras that we've talked about. It's Union Luxembourg, and they have a really similar history to Racing because their own merger happened only 2 years after Racing. So they started off at pretty much the same time in the same year, and they went to compete and rival Spora's achievements for really long until you've mentioned that Sport just stopped winning, and Union featured many of the national team's best players and were able to step out to the European stage in more years than not. And I think the 80s and 90s are mainly about Union, and that's what Luxembourgish football history chronicles usually say as well, that they were the biggest traditional team, even if they were sometimes picked to the title, because there were no eras where only one club. I think that's part of the magic of Luxembourgish football. There were no really long spells where a team won 10 in a row or something, but Union were always up there, even when Spora went down to second division and came back in those years. Union stayed successful, so I think that also contributed to why Spora's trophy cabinet kind of dried up and stayed locked for decades at some point.
I mean, the thing is, though, like, it still makes it pretty exciting, though, doesn't it? It leaves it open for any club to win it, which is always a good watch. I mean, again, just talking about my experience as a Celtic fan, there's always fans of other clubs in Scotland saying, "Oh, it must get boring, winning all these titles all the time." It's like, well, it's not really, but at the same time, I do acknowledge that leagues are far more interesting when there's more than one club competing for it. Obviously, I don't have a horse in those races, so maybe that's why I find it a bit more interesting. But it just depends on who you support and what your history as a supporter is as well. But at the very least, it makes it pretty exciting to know that the league is as open as it is in Luxembourg. But now we enter the era of this new merger club. I think it's 2005 that merger goes through. How have they got on since then?
Well, since then, I have to say Racing Union haven't been a real I don't know, the real big guns in Luxembourgish football. They haven't won the league title. They won a cup in 2017-18, so that's not too bad. They're always in the top half of the first division, but that's about as far as it gets with their current successes. Unfortunately, there was kind of a major financial problem altogether in Luxembourgish football around the millennium, because in the years leading up to it, uh, as I've already mentioned, Union's successes in the 1980s, 1990s kind of prompted all the other ambitious clubs to also live up to those standards and sign players on part-time contracts, because what I've said, Luxembourg became part-time semi-professional league in the 90s. So it kind of backfired after about 10 years, and the teams had to restrict themselves, restrict the budgets, let go of a lot of players. And that was when the second wave of mergers came around, about 2000. And part of it was Sporaz merging with Union. So once again, the two rivals, the two traditional capital teams. And that's why they are now called Racing Union Luxembourg, that team. I've actually talked about the topic with one of the players, Spora, who played there in the last season as well, actually. Alain Dalbasic, who's a midfielder for the team. I hope I pronounce his name well. So he told me a couple of interesting things about how the club handled it. And he said some players didn't receive any sort of communication from the team about where their futures would lie or whether they would be contracted to the new club or brought over. So it resulted in a lot of free agents and players moving around trying to find a club in the first division or second division at least. But of course, they've had to settle for grassroots football for the next couple of years. And it was that great uncertainty that's resulted in Spora getting relegated in the last game in their history, unfortunately, by a 1-5 loss at a crucial time. I think it was a relegation playoff or that sort of thing, when I think Luxembourgish League was set up like the Scottish League right now, where the league just split into two halves. And then it was like a crucial game for survival, which Spora lost in the last round of games, 5-1. And that was the end of it. That's when they saw each other last time. And the merger only became official during that last game. At halftime, the players were told that there was really no point fighting or no point trying to stay up, because it was already done and dusted. The deal had gone through. It was decided that they were no longer a football club technically, and that's how they had to play 45 minutes, and that's how they conceded all the goals and went down eventually.
Right, I see. Okay, so falling a bit of hard times as well. I mean, yeah, it is just really interesting though that there's this trend across 100 years pretty much of these two big city rivals merging with each other, which is crazy, and it's almost become a kind of history repeats itself sort of aspect within the heritage of that club. It's just, yeah, it's really, really fascinating and really, really interesting when you look at other clubs from Luxembourg as well. As you said, branches and family trees, absolutely obsessed with the idea of that. So yeah, just quite interesting. I mean, do you think that more mergers will happen eventually or soon? Or has money from, clubs in Luxembourg competing in like the Europa Conference League, for instance, or the qualifiers of the Europa League stabilised things a bit more, that clubs feel they don't have to pool the resources in the way that a lot of these major clubs have come about?
It does bring more money, and there are important people in France and Luxembourg, wealthy entrepreneurs who've done a lot for Luxembourgish football in terms of financing the academies or the clubs, taking over them and just building them up, giving professional contracts to best players. And now Luxembourg are actually able to lure players from the French lower division, giving them equal wages or even higher, of course, and presenting them with a chance to compete in Europe. Actually, just this season, the Ferdinand, one of the European qualifier clubs this season, signed two Argentinians and the Costa Rican, all from their domestic leagues. So none of those players had ever played in Europe before. So it's kind of a strange scouting mission. I don't know how that works. I don't know how their scouting department actually looked at those players or whether they were able to compile an accurate report on them. But
it's okay. Something similar happened to Dundee. They're obviously back in the Scottish Premiership this season. I think they signed a player from Mexico, a striker. I think his name's Perales, maybe. I can't remember. And about 2 days later, they got linked to another Mexican player, same league. I thought, or was it the same team? I can't remember if it was the same team or the same league. It was definitely the same league, maybe the same team as well. And they were like, "Oh, this is class. Obviously, our scouting department's working." It turns out it was nothing to do with the scouting department. They had just asked the striker they'd brought in, "Oh, is there any other players that you'd recommend?" And he basically just told him his best mate so that he could fly him over and have him play for Dundee and stay in Scotland. Mental.
I could imagine something similar happening here as well, of course, because I can't see myself. Just I don't know. I can't see the situation unfolding where those scouts say, "Oh yeah, there's some talented lads," but they play in the Argentinian second division, which we watch every week, of course. I don't know how that could have happened.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the Argentinian second tier isn't a terrible standard as well. Like that seems like would you? I don't know if you'd agree with me. Would you say that seems like quite a coup for clubs from Luxembourg or?
Yeah, it's not too bad, I think, because yeah, we've signed from much lower divisions before, of course, but now it's improved a lot lately, really, and now we get players from the German third division, sometimes second. Just now, Swift Esper signed one of the best players in the league, probably Rashid Alioui. He's a striker who played for Morocco several times, so former international, plays for Angers in the French top division a couple of years ago, and he's still only 31, I think, so plenty of years in him. Last year, Dudelange signed, I think his name was Manuel Acosta, something like that. He played at the 2018 World Cup with Morocco as a centre back.
Amazing.
He had played for Olympiacos before and Red Star Belgrade, maybe it was, I don't know, a couple of European teams. Unfortunately, he suffered a major injury before the season and had to retire only weeks after signing for Dudelange. But it goes to show that Luxembourgish clubs now have the power and that allure. And I don't know, I think they're just good enough with the infrastructure and financial details as well that they can show more established international European players that there is a chance for them to come here. And that, of course, applies to players from other continents, like well, I've said, the Costa Rican international. Formerly, he played 6 games for Costa Rica, but never ever played in Europe. So now he's 33. Of course, he probably sees this is going to be his last chance, and he wanted to see what the European dream is about in footballing terms. How it's like to go abroad for a European game, probably a qualifier, which he played at, and the team wasn't too bad, but they ended up getting eliminated, so it might stay as his last and first and last European game in his career.
It's still great though. I mean, it shows that maybe just in the case of Dudelange that they've at least got a little bit of money to throw around, and as you said, they're targeting players from different markets than other European nations potentially would. They're looking at players who are maybe coming to the end of their careers and saying, this could be your last chance for this or the next thing, or come here and see out your years here, which is obviously a good thing. It's a tactic that's worked up here before in other nations as well. And of course, into the bargain, they're going to be staying in a beautiful country as well. So why wouldn't they?
Yeah, exactly. And both of those strategies that you've mentioned, teams going for these aging internationals and also going for the people that dropped out of the academies in bigger countries. Those both work really well, and they just kind of I don't know, like complement each other because they are able to provide a good dynamic, a good hierarchy within the squad, and the aging players can also have the younger ones develop and actually, I don't know, just go through what they have to go through after being released from those academies in the better nations, like what happened with Hesper last year. They recruited Rayon Philippe, who had previously played for Dijon's reserve team in France, but wasn't ultimately considered successful enough. And then in Luxembourg, he went on to score, I think, 29 goals and 23 assists or something in 30 games. So that was absolute mad numbers. He was the top goal contributor in Europe in the end, in all European top leagues, just above Erling Haaland. So it was a tight competition all the way through last year. And then he got snapped up by a German second Bundesliga team, Braunschweig, I think. So that shows the young people as well that there is a chance for them to come here and build themselves up, like take one step back so they can take two forward in the end of the season if they do well and actually meet the expectations.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think. I mean, it's quite similar in I think Cyprus and Latvia as well, where they kind of sell it as a place for young players from, like, for example, Africa or South America or Asia, where they can go and make their breakthrough in Europe and then, maybe get picked up by a larger club from a larger league or a league further up the coefficient or whatever term you want to use. But just to go back to the mergers, is it still a big thing among football clubs in Luxembourg at the moment?
Well, actually, at lower leagues, it still is a presence. Unfortunately, it's hard to swallow. I think for supporters still because like no one likes to see their a favorite team disappear, of course. But it happens every year, unfortunately. Well, most years at least. There was one last year, and I think that team has gone bust since then. So it wasn't really a long-lasting merger. They tried to probably save themselves at the last opportunity. They thought it was, I don't know, feasible to actually salvage themselves as a team, but in the end, it proved not enough. So they went down. And of course, more of these can happen in the future because it's still a really small country that's packed with football clubs. It's also important to know that about 90% of the football clubs are in the bottom half of the country, geographically in the southern part. That's where all the big cities are. Well, not cities, but towns and the major places. And even in the first division, there's only one team from the northern half of Luxembourg. So it's really strangely distributed. I think it compares to Iceland, where the clubs are in or around the capital and the other places are basically uninhabited. So that's a similar structure here in Luxembourg. And that's why many of the things, yeah.
I was just going to say, it's not too dissimilar from Scotland either, because you've got, I mean, the majority of teams in Scotland are around the Central Belt, so kind of that strip of land, that bit between Glasgow and Edinburgh, kind of going up to Stirling and down to like South Lanarkshire and stuff. But there's only one team from the Highlands of Scotland in the top tier, and that's Ross County, because Aberdeen isn't always considered the Highlands. I'm a bit iffy about saying that because some people feel quite strongly about it, but they're not really from the Highlands. Inverness are in the tier below. And then I don't think there are actually any other clubs from the Highlands in the Scottish pyramid system at the moment. Some from around Elgin and Forres and stuff like that, but none like actually kind of from Inverness and beyond. None from the islands either. So I think that there's a bit of disparity there as well. So it is quite interesting just how these clubs kind of pop up around major population centres and stuff.
Yeah, it's all interesting, not just talk about football, but of course, in a demographic sense, the whole country is structured like that, and the northern parts are mostly just forests and hills. So that probably explains why there's not many clubs here. So the point I was getting to is that exactly because of this structure, it means most of the clubs are close to each other, so that increases the chance of them being merged if one of the clubs aren't in a financial situation to continue. And so it still happens, as I've said. Even the current first division clubs include ones that were founded in 2015 or 2005, as with Racing Club 2003. So it was really most of them happened after the millennium, as I've already said, and it could happen anytime, really.
Yeah, okay, I get you. I mean, kind of throughout this episode, as you've alluded to and as we were talking off air, you seem pretty buzzing about the international side though at the moment, mate. How are things looking for them right now? I think there's a lot of cause for optimism, I would say.
I'm really enthusiastic about the topic, of course. Much more enthusiastic than the club scene and getting a club into the Conference League. That's kind of a sensitive topic for now, so let's forget that. Talking about the Euros, there's a chance, as I've already said, if not now, then in 4 years' time or 8 years' time. The introduction of the Nations League helps a lot. Naturally, I don't quite actually grasp how the whole method works, because I swear it's different every year. The Nations League, like who qualifies where. I don't know what places are given in the end, because sometimes it gets you a World Cup qualifier place or a European Championship qualifier, whatever it is. Like Luxembourg just has to perform as good as possible and then hope for the best. Because as I've already seen with some predictions, they actually have a decent chance of making it to the playoffs at least, either straight through the qualification system or through this other second chance presented by the Nations League, where Luxembourg continue to present themselves as a strong Division C outfit. And I think they have every chance to enter Division B in due time, because they've really been building towards that, and they've got the consistency. They've got a young group of players who are really exciting and play for some of the biggest clubs. We've got players in the Bundesliga. We had a player in the Championship last year with Norwich City in Daniel Finani. Unfortunately, he's been sold to the German second division now, but that's still not too bad. We've got players in Austria, in the Dutch top division, in the Belgian top division. So there's people to root for, and there's every reason to believe that this group of players can be the golden era of Luxembourgish football altogether, and they could be the first to make it to a major competition, whether it's the Euros or a World Cup. No one knows yet.
Well, obviously, I'm wishing Luxembourg all the best in their upcoming tournaments, and hopefully our listeners will be as well after listening to this. I think that'll do us for tonight, Bence. Once again, thank you so much for joining me to talk through the history of Racing Club Luxembourg and a little bit more about the landscape of like mergers and things like that in Luxembourg in general. Of course, if anyone wants to go out and check, Bence's other work and what he does, you can follow him on X. I think it's just at Luxembourg Footy or Footy Luxembourg or some combination of those. You'll probably be already aware of him. He pops up quite frequently, especially when the national team are playing, so please do go and support his other work. Of course, if there's a topic that you want us to discuss or want to talk about with us, then you can get in touch with us as well. You can DM us on X, that's at _Footy Heritage, or you can also email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. We're happy to talk about anything under the broad banner of football history and heritage, so that could be anything from identity, lost clubs, place, former stadiums, fan cultures. If there's something that you want to talk to us about or think we should be aware of, then get in touch. We'll have a chat with you and we'll see if it's something that we can fit in with the project. But for now, Bence, say goodbye.
Thank you for listening. Goodbye, everyone.
And it's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.